It was the kind of New Year's Eve that people dream about. Soft snowflakes falling, fireworks bursting in the distance, and a city alive with celebration. For Anna, however, the evening was anything but celebratory. She had been invited to a small gathering at her friend Lisa's remote cabin, tucked deep in the woods. It was supposed to be an intimate celebration, away from the bustling city. A night to reflect, relax, and ring in the new year with a handful of close friends. Anna arrived just after sunset. The cabin was picturesque, a rustic wood structure illuminated by string lights and a crackling fireplace, visible through the frosted windows. 5 others were already there. Lisa, her boyfriend Mark, their mutual friends Sarah, and a couple, Ben and Claire. Everyone seemed in high spirits, the air thick with the scent of spiced cider and laughter. As the night progressed, Anna felt a peculiar sense of unease. It wasn't anything tangible, with just a creeping sensation that settled in her stomach and wouldn't leave. She chalked it up to her mind playing tricks in the unfamiliar, isolated setting. That was, until Sarah mentioned something unsettling. "Did Lisa tell you about the land this cabin is built on?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed but eager. Lisa shot her a glare. "Don't start that nonsense, Sarah." But Sarah pressed on. "This whole area used to be owned by the Winfield family. They disappeared without a trace in the early 1900s. People say the woods are cursed, that the family never really left." Everyone laughed nervously, except for Anna, whose discomfort deepened. Midnight was approaching when Mark suggested they play a New Year's version of hide and seek. "It'll be fun," he said, his grin mischievous. "One person hides, and the rest of us try to find them before the countdown. Whoever finds them gets the first toast of the year." Anna wasn't thrilled about wandering the woods in the dark, but didn't want to be a killjoy. She volunteered to hide, hoping it would get the game over with faster. With a flashlight in hand, she trudged into the snow-laden forest. The night was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of her boots. She found a decent hiding spot behind a cluster of pines and turned off her flashlight, letting her eyes adjust to the dark. Minutes ticked by. She could faintly hear the others calling her name, their voices carrying through the trees. Then silence. It struck her as odd. Where had everyone gone? She waited a few more minutes, her breath freezing air. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. It was a low, guttural whisper. "Anna." Every muscle in her body tightening. The voice was soft yet chilling, and it came from somewhere to her left. Her heart raced as she scanned the darkness. "Guys, this isn't funny," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Just that oppressive silence again. She decided to head back to the cabin, her flashlight flickering ominously as she made her way. The trees seemed to close in around her, the snow absorbing every sound except her frantic breathing. When she finally reached the clearing, her stomach dropped. The cabin was dark. No lights, no laughter, no sign of her friends. "Lisa? Mark, anyone?" she shouted, but only her echo replied. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under her weight. Inside, the cabin was eerily still. The fire had gone out, and the clock on the mantel read 11:58. Anna's flashlight flickered again before going out completely, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, but it was dead. And then she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back room. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the room was ajar, and the tapping grew louder as she approached. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. Hanging from the ceiling above it was a crudely made noose, swaying gently as though recently disturbed. Before she could react, the cabin door slammed shut behind her and the lights flickered back on. The clock struck midnight, and outside, fireworks lit up the sky. When Anna turned back to the room, the chair was empty, but she could swear she saw shadowy figures standing just beyond the window, watching her. Her friends were never found.
Story number 2.
The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. Daniel had drawn the short straw at work and was stuck closing the store on New Year's Eve. The store was a small electronics shop tucked into a nearly abandoned strip mall on the outskirts of town. It was supposed to be a quiet shift with customers scarce during the late hours. The only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of the ancient heating system. Daniel spent most of the evening scrolling through his phone, counting down the minutes until he could lock up and leave. Around 11:15, the store bell jingled, signaling someone had come in. Daniel looked up, surprised. A tall man in an old-fashioned trench coat stood just inside the door, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his voice echoing in the empty store. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving. Daniel felt a prickle of unease. "We're closing soon, but if you're looking for something specific, I can help you find it." The man slowly raised a hand and pointed toward the back of the store where the security cameras were displayed. Without a word, he turned and began walking down the aisle. Something about the way he moved was off, too smooth, almost gliding rather than walking. Daniel shook off the thought and followed him. When he reached the camera display, the man was gone, vanished, as if he'd stepped into thin air. Daniel spun around, scanning the aisles, but the store was empty. "Sir?" he called out, but only silence greeted him. Uneasy, Daniel checked the security footage on the nearest monitor. The cameras showed him walking to the back of the store, but no sign of the man. Not when he entered, not when he walked down the aisle. It was as if Daniel had imagined the whole thing. He laughed nervously, trying to convince himself it was just a trick of the light or his tired mind playing games. But as he stared at the screen, he noticed something else. Behind the counter, where he had been standing just minutes earlier, a figure was crouched. It was too blurry to make out any details, but it was there, unmoving. Heart pounding, Daniel turned to look at the counter. There was nothing there. He switched back to the live feed, but the figure was still on the monitor. It hadn't moved. A chill ran down his spine as the store lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the bell at the door jingled again. Daniel rushed to the front, expecting to see someone leaving, but the door was locked. The air felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. The lights flickered again, longer this time. When they stabilized, he froze. The man in the trench coat was standing at the end of the aisle, facing him. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. The man tilted his head as if considering the question. Then, without a sound, he began to walk forward. Daniel backed away, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his phone to call for help. But the screen was black, dead despite being fully charged earlier. The man stopped a few feet away, his face still obscured by shadow. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed at Daniel. "Midnight," the man said, his voice a low rasp that echoed unnaturally in the empty store. Daniel didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the back exit, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. When he burst out into the freezing night air, he didn't stop running until he reached his car. As he sped away, he glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 12:01. He had made it, or so he thought. The next morning, Daniel didn't show up for his shift. His manager called him repeatedly, but there was no answer. Concerned, they went to his apartment. The door was locked from the inside. When they broke in, they found Daniel sitting in a chair in front of his TV. The screen was filled with static, and Daniel's eyes were wide open, staring blankly at it. He wasn't breathing. On the coffee table in front of him was a single note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Midnight isn't the end."
Story number 3.
The clock struck 11:45 p.m. as Claire guided her car down the winding country road. She was heading to a New Year's Eve party at her friend's farmhouse, a few miles beyond a stretch of desolate woods. Snow blanketed the ground, reflecting her headlights in a way that made the dark road seem eerily alive. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from her friend Karen. "Where are you? It's almost midnight. Don't take the old bridge." Claire frowned. She'd been down this road a dozen times and never noticed a bridge. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to Karen's habit of dramatizing everything and continued driving. Minutes later, Claire saw it. A narrow wooden bridge stretched over a frozen creek. A weathered sign at the entrance read, "Bridge out, use detour." But there was no visible detour, just the pitch-black woods. "I'm not turning back now," Claire muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. She drove onto the bridge at the planks groaning beneath her car. Midway across, her car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in unsettling silence. She tried the ignition again, but nothing happened. The cold began to creep in, and her breath fogged up the windshield. Outside, the woods seemed unnaturally still. No wind, no rustling branches, just oppressive quiet. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. She groaned in frustration and reached for her flashlight. If she could just figure out what was wrong with the car, she could be on her way. As she stepped out into the biting cold, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something felt wrong. She shined the flashlight around, illuminating the frozen creek below and the dense, shadowy woods beyond. Then she heard it, a faint crunch like footsteps on snow. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. She crouched to inspect her car, but her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Her heart raced as she fumbled with it, smacking the side to get it to work. That's when she heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Claire straightened, her breath visible in the cold air. She turned toward the sound, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark. A figure stood at the edge of the bridge. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and crooked like a marionette. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, deep, hollow voids, seemed to pierce through her. Who are you?" Claire stammered, backing toward her car. The figure didn't respond. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movements unnervingly jerky. Claire scrambled back into the car, locking the doors. She turned the key in the ignition desperately, praying the engine would start. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the driver's side window. Its head tilted unnaturally back as though studying her. The car roared to life. Without thinking, Claire floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the icy planks as the car lurched forward, clearing the bridge. She didn't dare look back until she was several miles away, the farmhouse lights finally visible in the distance. When she arrived, Karen ran out to meet her. "Claire, are you okay? Did you take the bridge?" Claire nodded, her hands trembling as she stepped out of the car. Karen's face paled. "You weren't supposed to. The bridge, it's cursed. People say you shouldn't cross it after dark." Claire's heart sank. "Why?" Karen hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "The last person who tried, they saw something that follows you home." Claire laughed nervously, but it came out hollow. "That's ridiculous. I'm fine." Karen didn't look convinced. Later that night, after the party ended, Claire returned home. Exhausted, she climbed into bed, telling herself Karen's story was just a silly superstition. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard it again, soft footsteps moving slowly outside her window. Too afraid to look, she lay frozen in bed as the sound grew louder. And then a faint tap, tap, tap on the glass. When she finally worked up the courage to turn her head, her blood ran cold. The figure was there, staring at her through the window. It smiled.
Story number 4.
The New Year's Eve air was heavy with the promise of snow, and the streets were unnervingly quiet. Melanie had planned to spend the night at her apartment, avoiding the drunken chaos of the city's celebrations. She wasn't much for parties anyway. Instead, she was armed with a bottle of wine, her favorite blanket, and a collection of true crime documentaries queued up on her TV. At 10:37 p.m., Melanie's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I see you." She froze, her eyes darting to the nearest window. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the curtains were drawn tightly shut. Probably a wrong number, she told herself, but unease crept into her mind. She texted back, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly. "The one who's been watching." Her chest tightened as she stared at the screen. A prank, she decided. It had to be. But just to be safe, she checked the locks on her windows and doors, her heart racing with every step. At 11:01 p.m., another text buzzed through. "Nice red blanket. It suits you." The blanket, the one she was currently wrapped in, her stomach dropped. Whoever was texting her could see her right now. "Okay, very funny," she texted back, trying to mask her fear. "I'm calling the cops." This time, the reply took a little longer. "They won't get here in time." A loud knock at the door made her jump. She clutched her phone and backed away from the living room toward her bedroom. The knock came again, harder this time. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't answer. I want this to be a surprise." She sprinted to her bedroom, locking the door and grabbing her laptop to call the police. As she explained her situation to the dispatcher, she kept her ear pressed to the door. "We're sending someone now," the dispatcher said. "Stay on the line." Melanie nodded, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Okay." The knocking stopped. A moment of silence stretched, and for a second she thought maybe whoever it was had left. Then she heard it, the faint creak of her living room floorboards. Her phone buzzed. Closer. Melanie muffled a scream and backed into the corner of her room. The dispatcher's voice was faint, asking her to stay calm, but all she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving through her apartment. "Please hurry," she whispered into the phone. Another text came through. "Almost there." The doorknob to her bedroom rattled. Melanie screamed, dropping the phone. She grabbed the nearest thing, a heavy lamp, and held it up, ready to swing. The rattling stopped. Then from behind her, a low voice whispered, "Happy New Year." Her scream was cut short. When the police arrived, they found the apartment empty. The locks were intact, the windows unbroken. Melanie's phone lay on the floor, still connected to the dispatcher. The only sign she'd ever been there was the red blanket, now folded neatly on the couch, and a single message written on the wall in smeared lipstick. "Midnight is just the beginning."